The autumn wind of 1886 howled across the Kansas plains like a banshee, rattling the weathered shutters of lonely ranchers' modest homestead on the outskirts of Dodge City. At 43, Thomas "Lonely" McCready had earned his nickname through years of self-imposed isolation, working his small cattle ranch with only his horse Dusty for company. The townspeople whispered about his past. Some said he'd lost a family to cholera. Others claimed he'd been a gunslinger who'd hung up his holsters after one too many graves. The truth was simpler and more painful. Thomas had once been a husband and father, but a moment of cowardice during an Apache raid had cost him everything. While other men fought to defend their families, he'd hidden in a root cellar, emerging only to find his wife Sarah and infant son buried beneath the ashes of their burned home. The guilt had driven him to this remote corner of Kansas, where he could punish himself in solitude. Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story. On this particular October morning, the storm had raged all night. Thomas awoke to an unusual silence, the kind that follows nature's fury. As he stepped onto his porch to assess any damage, his weathered boot nearly kicked something soft. Looking down, his breath caught in his throat. There, wrapped in a threadbare piece of calico, was a baby. The infant couldn't have been more than a few days old, its tiny fists curled against the cold. But what made Thomas's blood run cold wasn't the abandoned child, it was the letter pinned to the makeshift swaddling. With trembling hands, he unfolded the water-stained paper and read, "Thomas McCready, you know what you did 15 years ago. This child's mother paid the price for your cowardice. Now you have a chance to make things right. Raise this baby as your own, or the whole town will learn the truth about the night Sarah and little James died. The child's name is Hope. Don't let her down like you let them down." The letter wasn't signed, but the knowledge it contained made Thomas's knees buckle. Someone knew. Someone had been watching him all these years, and now they'd placed this innocent life in his hands as some twisted form of justice. The baby stirred, letting out a weak cry that pierced through Thomas's shock. Without thinking, he scooped up the child, feeling the familiar weight of an infant in his arms, a sensation he'd thought he'd never experience again. Hope's eyes opened, revealing the deepest blue he'd ever seen, and in that moment, something long dead stirred in his chest. "Well, little one," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "looks like it's just you and me now." As Thomas carried Hope inside, he didn't notice the figure watching from the ridge overlooking his property. The mysterious observer smiled grimly before disappearing into the morning mist, leaving behind only hoofprints that the wind would soon erase. Inside his cabin, Thomas faced his first challenge: how to care for a newborn. He'd helped birth calves, but a human baby was entirely different. He fashioned a makeshift crib from a wooden crate, lined it with his softest blankets, and rode into town for supplies, the baby tucked securely inside his coat. Dodge City in 1886 was a place where secrets festered like infected wounds. The town had grown from a rough cattle settlement into a more civilized community, but beneath its veneer of respectability lurked the same violence and prejudice that had always defined the frontier. As Thomas hitched his horse outside Zimmerman's general store, curious eyes followed his every movement. "Well, I'll be," muttered Ezra Zimmerman, the store's portly owner. "Thomas McCready with a baby. Didn't know you had it in you to find yourself a woman." "Found her on my doorstep," Thomas replied curtly, gathering milk, cloth for diapers, and other necessities. "Someone abandoned her." The store fell silent. In a town where gossip spread faster than prairie fire, this was front-page news. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the mayor's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of Dodge City, stepped forward with narrowed eyes. "Abandoned, you say? How convenient. And you just happened to find this child?" Her voice dripped with suspicion. "Perhaps you'd care to explain to Sheriff Morrison exactly how this baby came to be in your possession?" Thomas felt the weight of every stare in the store. These people had never fully accepted him, and now they sensed blood in the water. "I've got nothing to hide," he said, though the letter in his pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. As he left the store, Thomas overheard Mrs. Thornton's stage whisper, "Mark my words, there's more to this story. Men like Thomas McCready don't just find babies, they make them." The ride back to his ranch felt longer than usual, with Hope sleeping peacefully against his chest. Thomas knew that by evening the entire town would be buzzing with theories about the mysterious baby. Some would be harmless speculation, but others would be dangerous accusations that could destroy both their lives. That night, as Thomas sat by the fire with Hope in his arms, he reread the threatening letter. Whoever had written it knew his deepest shame, the night he'd failed to protect his family. But they'd also given him something precious, a chance at redemption. This child needed him, and perhaps in caring for her, he could finally forgive himself. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant sound of hoofbeats. Thomas tensed, wondering if the mysterious letter writer was returning, or if Sheriff Morrison was coming to investigate the town's newest scandal. Either way, he knew his quiet life of self-imposed exile was over. As Hope stirred in his arms, Thomas made a silent vow. Whatever secrets lay buried in his past, whatever dangers lurked in Dodge City's shadows, he would protect this child with his life. She was his second chance, and he wouldn't fail again. The storm had brought more than rain to his doorstep. It had brought hope itself. 3 weeks had passed since Hope's arrival, and Thomas McCready found himself living in a fishbowl. Every trip to town brought stares, whispers, and barely concealed hostility. The baby had thrived under his care, but the social storm surrounding them was just beginning. Sheriff Jake Morrison, a fair but thorough man in his 50s, had visited twice to investigate the foundling situation, as the town council had dubbed it. Each time, Thomas had stuck to his story. He'd found the baby on his doorstep after the storm. The sheriff seemed inclined to believe him, but pressure from influential townspeople was mounting. "You understand my position, Thomas," Morrison had said during his last visit, watching as Thomas expertly changed Hope's diaper. "Mrs. Thornton and her ladies' auxiliary are demanding answers. They think it's improper for a bachelor to raise a child alone, especially under these mysterious circumstances." Thomas had nodded grimly. He'd expected this resistance, but it still stung. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same people who'd ignored his existence for 15 years now suddenly cared deeply about his living arrangements. It was on a crisp November morning that Thomas encountered his first unlikely ally. He'd brought Hope to town for supplies and a visit to Doc Henley for a health check. As he emerged from the doctor's office, he nearly collided with a young woman carrying an armload of books. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, steadying herself as several volumes tumbled to the ground. Thomas quickly knelt to help gather them, noting titles like Modern Educational Methods and Child Development Theory. "No harm done, miss," he said, rising to hand her the books. The woman was perhaps 28, with intelligent brown eyes and auburn hair pinned back in a practical style. She wore a simple but well-made dress that marked her as educated but not wealthy. "You must be Mr. McCready," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore, the new school teacher. I've heard about your situation." Thomas tensed, expecting another lecture about propriety, but Eleanor's expression was warm and curious rather than judgmental. "That's quite a beautiful baby," she continued, peering at Hope, who was awake and alert in Thomas's arms. "How old is she?" "About a month now, near as I can tell," Thomas replied cautiously. Eleanor studied Hope with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years around children. "She's remarkably healthy for an abandoned infant. Someone took very good care of her before she came to you." This observation struck Thomas like a thunderbolt. In his focus on caring for Hope and dealing with town gossip, he hadn't fully considered the implications. The baby had been clean, well-fed, and showed no signs of neglect or illness. Whoever had left her had cared for her properly. This wasn't a desperate abandonment, but a calculated placement. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, "you seem to know something about children. Would you mind if I asked your opinion about something?" Eleanor glanced around the busy street, noting the curious stares they were attracting. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private. I was just heading to the schoolhouse to prepare lessons. You're welcome to join me. The Dodge City Schoolhouse was a modest wooden building on the edge of town, surrounded by a small yard where children played during recess. Eleanor led Thomas inside, where neat rows of desks faced a blackboard covered with arithmetic problems. "Please, sit," Eleanor said, gesturing to a chair near her desk. "Now, what did you want to ask me?" Thomas hesitated, then pulled out the mysterious letter. "Someone left this with Hope. I'm hoping you might have some insight." Eleanor read the letter carefully, her expression growing more serious with each line. When she finished, she looked up at Thomas with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Mr. McCready, this letter suggests that Hope's placement with you wasn't random. Someone knows your history and believes you have a debt to pay." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "May I ask what happened 15 years ago?" For the first time in years, Thomas found himself wanting to tell someone the truth. Perhaps it was Eleanor's gentle manner, or maybe he was simply tired of carrying the burden alone. Slowly, haltingly, he told her about the Apache raid, his cowardice, and the loss of his family. Eleanor listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. McCready, Thomas, what you describe sounds like a man who was terrified and made a split-second decision that he's regretted ever since. That doesn't make you a coward. It makes you human. Tell that to my wife and son," Thomas said bitterly. "I think," Eleanor said gently, "that whoever wrote this letter might not be your enemy. They could be someone who believes you deserve a chance at redemption." Before Thomas could respond, the schoolhouse door burst open. A tall, weathered woman with graying hair and kind eyes entered, carrying a medical bag. "Eleanor, dear, I saw you come in and thought I'd—" The woman stopped short when she saw Thomas and Hope. "Oh, forgive me. I didn't realize you had company." "Dr. Margaret Henley, meet Thomas McCready and baby Hope," Eleanor said. "Dr. Henley is our town's healer and midwife." Thomas knew of Dr. Henley by reputation. She was one of the few female doctors on the frontier, having earned her medical degree back east before coming to Kansas. The townspeople tolerated her because they needed her skills, but many considered her an oddity. "Ah, the mysterious foundling," Dr. Henley said, approaching with professional interest. "May I?" Thomas handed Hope over, watching as the doctor performed a quick examination. Dr. Henley's eyebrows rose as she checked the baby's reflexes and general condition. "This child has been expertly cared for," she announced. "The umbilical cord was cut and treated by someone with medical knowledge. Her weight and development suggest she was born at full term and has been properly nourished since birth." "What does that mean?" Thomas asked. "It means," Dr. Henley said, exchanging a meaningful look with Eleanor, "that Hope wasn't abandoned by a desperate young woman. She was placed with you by someone who planned this very carefully." The three adults stared at each other as the implications sank in. Hope wasn't just a foundling. She was part of a larger plan, one that involved Thomas's past and someone with both medical knowledge and intimate details about his life. "There's something else," Dr. Henley added quietly. "I delivered a baby about a month ago to a young woman who came to me in secret. She paid in gold and left town immediately after the birth. She wouldn't give her name, but she asked specifically about Thomas McCready, wanted to know if he was a good man." Thomas felt the world tilt around him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth," Dr. Henley replied, "that you were a man carrying a heavy burden, but that I'd never known you to be anything but honest and decent." Eleanor reached out and touched Thomas's arm. "It seems you have more friends than you know, Thomas. And now you have two more." As if sensing the moment's importance, Hope chose that instant to smile, her first real smile, looking directly at Thomas with those impossibly blue eyes. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, but inside the schoolhouse, three unlikely allies were forming a bond that would change everything. December brought the first heavy snow to Dodge City, blanketing the town in pristine white that seemed to muffle both sound and secrets. Thomas had settled into a routine with Hope, who was now thriving under his care. The baby had grown noticeably, her blue eyes bright and alert, and she'd begun to recognize Thomas's voice, cooing happily when he spoke to her. However, the social pressure had intensified. Mrs. Thornton and her allies had petitioned the town council to remove Hope from Thomas's care, arguing that a single man was unfit to raise a child. The council, led by Mayor Harrison Thornton, Abigail's husband, had scheduled a hearing for the week before Christmas. Eleanor and Dr. Henley had become regular visitors to Thomas's ranch, helping with Hope's care and offering moral support. Eleanor had been teaching Thomas to read to the baby, insisting that early exposure to language was crucial for development. Dr. Henley provided medical care and had begun investigating the mysterious circumstances of Hope's birth. It was during one of these visits that the first major revelation occurred. "Thomas," Dr. Henley said, settling into a chair by the fire while Eleanor played with Hope on a blanket, "I've been thinking about that young woman who came to me. Something's been nagging at me, and I finally remembered what it was." Thomas looked up from the coffee he was preparing. "What's that, Doc?" "She had a distinctive scar on her left hand, a crescent shape, like from a burn, and her accent, it wasn't local. Eastern, maybe Virginia or the Carolinas?" Eleanor frowned, bouncing Hope gently. "That's quite specific. Do you think she might have been someone from Thomas's past?" "That's what I'm wondering," Dr. Henley replied. "Thomas, in all your years before coming to Kansas, did you know anyone matching that description?" Thomas thought carefully, sifting through memories he'd tried to bury. Suddenly, his face went pale. "Sarah's sister," he whispered. "Rebecca. She had a scar like that from a cooking accident when we were children, but she died in the raid with the rest of them." "Are you certain?" Dr. Henley pressed gently. I thought I was. I found her body, or what I thought was her body. Everything was so burned, so destroyed." Thomas's voice trailed off as doubt crept in. Eleanor and Dr. Henley exchanged glances. "Thomas," Eleanor said carefully, "what if Rebecca survived? What if she's been alive all these years?" The possibility hit Thomas like a physical blow. If Rebecca had survived, if she'd been alive all this time while he'd tortured himself with guilt, the implications were staggering. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Thomas peered out the window to see Sheriff Morrison riding up with two other men, Mayor Thornton and Judge Cornelius Blackwood, the circuit judge who'd arrived in town the previous week. "Gentlemen," Thomas said as he opened the door, Hope cradled in his arms. "What brings you out in this weather?" Mayor Thornton, a pompous man with thinning hair and an expensive coat, stepped forward. "Mr. McCready, we're here on official business. There have been serious allegations made about your fitness as a guardian." Judge Blackwood, a stern man in his 60s with piercing gray eyes, studied Thomas and Hope with professional detachment. "Mr. McCready, I understand you've been caring for this child under unusual circumstances. I'm here to conduct a preliminary evaluation." Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Thomas, I'm sorry about this, but the mayor insisted on an immediate investigation." Eleanor stepped forward, her teacher's authority evident in her posture. "Judge Blackwood, I'm Eleanor Whitmore, the town school teacher. I've been observing Mr. McCready's care of this child, and I can attest to his competence and dedication. And I'm Dr. Margaret Henley," the doctor added. "From a medical standpoint, this baby is thriving under Mr. McCready's care. She's healthy, well-nourished, and clearly bonded with her caregiver." Judge Blackwood nodded politely, but remained focused on Thomas. "Mr. McCready, these ladies speak well of you, but I must ask, do you have any idea who this child's parents might be?" Thomas felt the weight of the mysterious letter in his pocket. He'd shared its contents with Eleanor and Dr. Henley, but revealing it to these men might open doors he wasn't ready to walk through. "No, sir," he said carefully. "She was left on my doorstep during the storm." Mayor Thornton snorted. "How convenient. Judge, surely you can see that this situation is highly irregular. A bachelor raising a foundling? It's unseemly." "What's unseemly," Dr. Henley interjected sharply, "is a community that would rather see a child placed in an institution than with a caring guardian simply because he's unmarried." Judge Blackwood raised a hand for silence. Dr. Henley raises a valid point. Mr. McCready, may I hold the child? Thomas hesitated, then carefully transferred Hope to the judge's arms. The baby looked up at the stern man with curious eyes, then reached up and grasped his finger with surprising strength. Something shifted in Judge Blackwood's expression. She's quite alert for her age. How old did you say she was? About 2 months now, Thomas replied. The judge studied Hope more carefully, and Thomas noticed his eyes narrow slightly. Mr. McCready, this child has very distinctive features. The shape of her eyes, the set of her jaw. She reminds me of someone. Who? Eleanor asked. Judge Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, still studying Hope. Finally, he looked up at Thomas with an unreadable expression. Mr. McCready, 15 years ago, I presided over the inquest into the Apache raid that destroyed your settlement. I remember the case well because of the unusual circumstances. Thomas's blood turned to ice. Unusual circumstances? Yes. You see, we never found all the bodies. Several people were listed as missing rather than confirmed dead because the destruction was so complete. One of those missing persons was a young woman named Rebecca Hartwell. The silence in the room was deafening. Eleanor and Dr. Henley stared at Thomas while Mayor Thornton looked confused by this turn in the conversation. Rebecca was your sister-in-law, wasn't she, Mr. McCready? Judge Blackwood continued. And this child, she has the Hartwell family features. I knew Rebecca's father well, served with him in the Mexican War. The resemblance is unmistakable. Thomas felt the world spinning around him. You're saying Hope is... I'm saying this child is likely Rebecca Hartwell's daughter, Judge Blackwood said firmly. Which means she's your niece, Mr. McCready, and if Rebecca is alive, as I'm beginning to suspect, then this isn't a case of abandonment. It's a family reunion. Mayor Thornton sputtered in confusion, but Sheriff Morrison stepped forward with new understanding. Judge, are you suggesting that Rebecca Hartwell survived the raid and has been living under an assumed identity? I'm suggesting exactly that, Judge Blackwood replied. And I believe she's been watching Mr. McCready all these years, waiting for the right moment to entrust him with her daughter's care. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of a single horse approaching broke the tension. Through the window, they could see a cloaked figure dismounting in the snow. Thomas's heart pounded as he recognized something familiar in the rider's movements. The figure approached the door and knocked softly. When Thomas opened it, a woman lowered her hood, revealing features that were achingly familiar, yet aged by 15 years of hardship. She had the same dark hair as Sarah, the same gentle eyes, and on her left hand, a crescent-shaped scar. "Hello, Thomas," Rebecca Hartwell said quietly. "I think it's time we talked." Hope, still in Judge Blackwood's arms, let out a delighted coo at the sound of her mother's voice, reaching toward the woman who had given her life. The mystery was beginning to unravel, but Thomas sensed that the most difficult revelations were yet to come. The reunion in Thomas's modest cabin was charged with 15 years of grief, guilt, and unspoken truths. Rebecca Hartwell stood in the doorway like a ghost made flesh, her eyes fixed on Hope, who gurgled happily in Judge Blackwood's arms, seemingly recognizing her mother's voice. "Rebecca," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "We thought you were dead. I thought I'd failed you too." Rebecca stepped inside, pulling off her traveling cloak to reveal a simple but well-made dress. She was thinner than Thomas remembered, with lines of hardship etched around her eyes, but she carried herself with a quiet strength that spoke of survival against impossible odds. "You didn't fail anyone, Thomas," she said softly. "You saved my life." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Mayor Thornton looked completely bewildered, while Sheriff Morrison and Judge Blackwood leaned forward with professional interest. Eleanor and Dr. Henley exchanged knowing glances. They'd suspected something. Like this. "I don't understand," Thomas said. "I hid in that root cellar while everyone else fought. I was a coward." Rebecca shook her head firmly. "Thomas, you were following Sarah's last request. She sent you to hide because she was protecting a secret. I was already in that cellar, barely conscious from blood loss after giving birth to my first child 3 days earlier." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Thomas staggered backward, gripping the back of a chair for support. "Your first child?" Eleanor asked gently. Rebecca nodded, her eyes never leaving Hope. "A son, born premature and sickly. He didn't survive the raid, but I did, because Thomas brought me water and food while the attack raged above us. When the Apache finally left and the settlement burned, Thomas helped me escape through the old mine shaft behind your property." Judge Blackwood set Hope carefully in her makeshift crib and pulled out a small notebook. "Miss Hartwell, this is a remarkable story, but I need to understand the timeline. If Mr. McCready helped you escape, why was he listed among the survivors while you were presumed dead?" Rebecca's expression grew pained. "Because I asked him to let everyone believe I had died. I was carrying the child of a man who wasn't my husband. My husband had been killed in a hunting accident 6 months earlier, and I'd made a terrible mistake with someone I trusted." The weight of her confession settled over the room. In 1886, an unmarried woman with a child faced social ostracism and economic ruin. Rebecca had chosen to disappear rather than face that fate. "Thomas helped me reach the railroad," Rebecca continued. "He gave me what little money he had and made me promise to build a new life somewhere safe. I took the name Rebecca Ashford and traveled to Virginia, where I found work as a seamstress." Thomas sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the realization that his perceived cowardice had actually been an act of heroism. "But why didn't you tell me? Why let me believe I was a coward all these years?" "Because I was ashamed," Rebecca admitted, tears flowing freely now. "And because I knew that if you thought I was dead, you'd mourn properly and eventually move on. I never expected you to punish yourself for 15 years. Dr. Henley stepped forward with her medical bag. "Rebecca, may I examine you? You've traveled a long way and you must be exhausted." As Dr. Henley tended to Rebecca, Judge Blackwood continued his questioning. "Miss Hartwell, what brought you back now? And why leave your daughter with Mr. McCready?" Rebecca accepted a cup of coffee from Eleanor before answering. "I've been ill. Consumption. The doctors in Richmond gave me 6 months to live, maybe less. I knew I needed to secure Hope's future, and there was only one man I trusted completely." She looked at Thomas with profound gratitude. "You see, I never stopped watching over you, Thomas. I hired investigators over the years to make sure you were safe. I knew about your guilt, your isolation, your self-imposed exile. When Hope was born healthy and strong, I knew what I had to do." "The letter," Thomas said suddenly. "You wrote that letter." Rebecca nodded. "I had to make you think someone was threatening you, because I knew you'd never accept Hope out of simple kindness. But if you thought caring for her was penance for past sins, you'd do it without question." Mayor Thornton, who had been silent throughout these revelations, finally spoke up. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that Mr. McCready is an unmarried man attempting to raise a child alone." Judge Blackwood fixed the mayor with a stern look. "Mr. Thornton, this man has been caring for his own niece, his family. That changes everything legally." Eleanor stepped forward with a determined expression. "Actually, Your Honor, it might not need to change anything at all." All eyes turned to the school teacher, who was blushing but resolute. "Thomas, I've grown to care deeply for both you and Hope over these past months. If you're willing, and if Rebecca approves, I'd be honored to help you raise her as your wife." The proposal hung in the air like morning mist. Thomas stared at Eleanor in amazement, while Rebecca smiled through her tears. "Eleanor," Thomas said slowly, "are you sure? Taking on a ready-made family, especially with Rebecca's illness?" "I'm sure," Eleanor replied firmly. "I've seen how you care for Hope, how you've opened your heart despite your fears. You're a good man, Thomas McCready, and I'd be proud to stand beside you." Rebecca reached out and took Eleanor's hand. "Sarah would have loved you," she said simply. "You have her strength and her kindness." Dr. Henley cleared her throat. "If I may interrupt this touching moment, I have a medical opinion to share. Rebecca, while your consumption is serious, it's not necessarily fatal. With proper care, rest, and the new treatments available, you could live for many more years." Hope chose that moment to wake up and cry, and Thomas instinctively moved to comfort her. As he lifted his niece into his arms, Rebecca watched with a mixture of joy and sorrow. "She knows you," Rebecca observed. "You're her father in every way that matters." Judge Blackwood closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Mr. McCready, based on what I've heard today, I see no reason why you shouldn't continue caring for Hope. In fact, I'll be recommending to the territorial authorities that you be granted formal guardianship." Mayor Thornton started to protest, but Sheriff Morrison cut him off. "Harrison, let it go. This family has been through enough." As the officials prepared to leave, Rebecca pulled Thomas aside. "I want to stay," she said quietly. "For whatever time I have left, I want to be near Hope, and I want to help you understand that you were never a coward. You were a hero who saved 2 lives that night." Thomas looked around his cabin, now filled with the people who had become his chosen family. Eleanor was cooing at Hope, Dr. Henley was organizing medical supplies, and Rebecca was finally home. "Stay as long as you want," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is your home, too." 6 months later, on a warm spring day in 1887, Thomas McCready married Eleanor Whitmore in a simple ceremony behind the schoolhouse. Rebecca, her health improved under Dr. Henley's care, served as matron of honor while Hope gurgled happily in the arms of her new adoptive mother. The lonely rancher was lonely no more. He had found his family, his purpose, and his redemption in the most unexpected way. And in the growing town of Dodge City, the story of the foundling who brought a family together became the stuff of legend, a reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most mysterious packages. As Thomas held his wife and daughter while Rebecca looked on with joy, he finally understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing love despite that fear. And in that choice, he had found his way home at last. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.